EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, we would love to take a crack at answering that question. We would also like to ask you a question. What is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply, like the man says. Message and data rates may apply. You can also send us an email if you prefer that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Also, we also have Matt Kabinski, trusty at work. We know that he's going to do a super job at answering those phone calls, getting the calls screened. Jeff Burson is handling social media. He also does a super job. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, we're streaming there right now. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will send that to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
Oh, fair to middling.
Got a very interesting, rather thoughtful question here from Patrick in Pierre, South Dakota. He says, Dear Dr. Anders, I would like to know if God expects me to be as literate as yourself and all the EWTN staff in order to enter into his kingdom. If you tell me the Apostles' Creed, I'll affirm that 100%. If you tell me that the Trinity is one God, three persons or natures, I'll affirm that 100%. I listen to your program and other EWTN shows mainly because you speak as family. You speak truth and common sense that draws me to continue to listen. The problem for me personally is that I can follow so far until you recite an author or a papal letter or a study, and then things start to trail off. I do read the Catholic Bible. I explore the Catechism. I'm starting to explore the Didache. That's it, though. I'm afraid that I have not lived up to what God would expect from his followers. At the age of 60, I'm not sure I can even catch up. Please pray for me, Patrick in Pierre, South Dakota.
Oh, thank you so much, Patrick. I really appreciate the question. I am certain that you are much closer to the heart of Jesus than I am, and your Catholic life is probably better than mine in many, many respects, and I would not take anything away from that whatsoever at all. Jesus tells us, the Catholic faith tells us, that we are united to God through charity. Charity and the virtues. That's how we're united to God. We are certainly not united to God by dropping bibliography on air. Right? That does not unite us to God, unless we do it in love, for the sake of God and love of neighbor, right? Christ's own ministry was not characterized by his erudite references to prominent Jewish writers of the time and, handing out long bibliographies of rabbinical scholarship. That's not how Jesus operated. Jesus operated by inviting people into fellowship with himself and with the poor and the marginalized. And he also attempted to provoke people into sort of waking up out of their self-assurance and superstitious ideas in order to see the humanity of people that they had disregarded to that point. So it really is, Jesus says, if you want to be sons of your Father in heaven, forgive your enemies. That's sort of the paradigm teaching of Christ. And so our explicit knowledge of divine revelation or sacred scripture or the history of theology, these things are vehicles and tools, but they're not ultimately what unites us to God. It is precisely charity which the Holy Spirit pours into our heart that unites us to Him. So, why do I talk the way I do? To be honest with you, the gospel tells me, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. And what brought me to faith, I came to faith through study, through learning. And that is an important part of my spirituality and my path, and I am myself, right? So I talk from the experience of faith that I have and the interests that I have and the things that make the faith intelligible, reasonable, and beautiful to me, in the hopes that other people will also find them helpful. But I'm far from believing that my own idiosyncratic personality and interests somehow define normative Catholicism. They don't. They just define me, right?
Okay.
And I'm a weirdo, right? I'm a weirdo. But I'd much rather, I mean, in the sight of God, have the charity of a Mother Teresa than the brilliance of a great theologian, which I don't consider myself. But I mean, if I had to pick, and Mother Teresa herself, who did not have a lot of interest or patience with theologians. Apparently, one time, a famous theologian came and gave an address to her sisters, and they asked Mother Teresa what she thought of the guy, and she said, "Well, he talks too much. He'd be better off if we handed him a broom."
Wow. Getting right to it there. Patrick, thank you so much for your very heartfelt letter, and we do appreciate that. Here's a quick question here from Bradley watching on Facebook. Where did this concept come from that Jesus is anti-religion or anti-ritual? I even saw a social media meme that's making the rounds these days, and it says, Jesus and the apostles built bridges, whereas religion has built walls. Is this a good concept or something we as Catholics should oppose?
Yeah, I thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So it's a long-standing position in some sectors of the Christian world, particularly Protestantism, but I've heard Catholics talk this way too, that imagine that the meaning of Christ is to reject ritualism or sort of the formal elements of religion. And I really don't think that's true to the texts themselves. I think what is true to the texts is that Jesus rejected the particular form of religiosity that in his own day, and for that matter in our day, that would draw people away from the genuine love of God and neighbor. And so anytime your religious practice, in whatever form it might take, draws you away from genuine care and concern and love for God and neighbor, then it's become superstitious and quite vicious and should be rejected. But even the formal critique of religion is a form. You see, well, you can't get away from the formal in religious practice or dialogue, even if it's to critique the thing. And that too can be done in a spirit of viciousness and anger and self-aggrandizement.
Don't want that. Bradley, thank you so much for your question. Stay tuned for more Call to Communion.
My wife and I are former Protestants who are considering converting to the Catholic Church.
Thank you, Jesus.
And we wanted to ask you about what the Catholic view of purgatory would be.
I have a religious teacher who tells us women should be priests.
How long you have to be in that school?
Mother Angelica answering the call. Sunday, 2 and 8 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on EWTN Radio.
Christ is the Answer with Father John Riccardo.
He always starts with the good things. The 7 letters to the churches and the book of Revelation is a great way to write letters to other people, by the way, or to have conversations with other people. You start with what's going well. You do this, this, and this really well. I love it. Thank you. Here's what you're lacking. And I think for many of us as men, what the Lord's communicating at that second part of the letter or the second part of the conversation is, here's what we're lacking. You don't ever spend enough time with me. You have no idea what I'm trying to offer you in the gift of my friendship. Or if you do, you don't make time for it. And if you would but come to me, I would change your life like that. But you don't come. Not with the regularity that I want you to come. Not with the ardor and the fervor and the passion that I want you to come. I have a hunch, I have more than a hunch, that's what he says to me, and I got a hunch that's what he would say to many of us.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Tom Price here telling you about 2 new books now available from EWTN Publishing. First, Mother Angelica's Guide to the Spiritual Life, from the nun who made it her life's work to instruct millions. This volume assembles her most profound and timeless advice on how you can grow in holiness and achieve your ultimate purpose to spend eternity in heaven with Jesus. Also, this new book, Blue Collar Apologetics by John Martinoni, How to Explain and Defend Catholic Teaching Using Common Sense, Simple Logic, and the Bible. So a couple of great ones for you there, Mother Angelica's Guide to the Spiritual Life and Blue Collar Apologetics by John Martinoni. They're available right now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Robert in Rancho Cucamonga, California, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hey, Robert, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thank you for taking my call, Dr. Anders. I love your show. I listen to it often. I hear a lot of reasons why people don't become Catholic or their hang-ups on it, whether it be Bible-based or theological questions or hang-ups. For me, and I never heard this on your radio station yet, it's about the social aspect. I'm in the largest county in the United States, California, the Inland Empire, and most of the parishes they're smaller. They don't have that much going on for guys my age in their mid to late 30s. It's mostly they're like young people, families who born to the faith, they're involved, or the extreme elderly on the other end, elderly, 70s and 80s. But in my age group, to get acclimated, it's pretty much non-existent unless I'm a divorced person. Which I've joined some RCAs. I dropped out. Only because, like I said, there's no one really hard to find groups my age that's socially doing things. I've been to several parishes.
Yeah. So
as a Baptist, there's lots of stuff going on as a Baptist.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm very sympathetic. I'm really sympathetic to your plight, profoundly so. Question for you: are you closer to San Bernardino or Los Angeles?
San Bernardino.
Okay. All right. Because I was going to say, I don't know much about San Bernardino Diocese. I know the L.A. Diocese has got a pretty big diocesan office with an awful lot of ministry work that happens at the diocesan level, and they oversee a lot of programming for a lot of different demographics. I'm not exactly sure what San Bernardino has going on, but most larger dioceses, beyond the parish level, they're going to have some diocesan level stuff. The problem you've identified is a real one. And it's one that I think about a lot because I work for a Catholic diocese, and we're always kind of trying to brainstorm to how do we. There are people that don't really fit within our existing programming.
Yeah.
We may be focused towards kids or families or whatever. And how do you get these other folks? And there are typically, again, and I would imagine San Bernardino's got this. There are parachurch, if you will, parish ministries that are aimed at specific demographics. But it is an uphill battle. And in my own Catholic life, I'm not in your situation, but when I became Catholic, I found that there was a dearth of programming at the parish level that enabled me to meet like-minded people with similar interests. And it took me a while as a Catholic to sort of build a friendship network of people, none of whom are really located in the same geographic parish. We're theology geeks and weirdos that like media and things like that. We we found our affinity group, but it was kind of tough, right? It was kind of tough. So you're not wrong. And the RCIA program can be very helpful, but can also just sort of be a hoop you have to jump through in order to receive the sacraments and be initiated. And that really is going to depend on the parish. So, I would encourage you, first of all, know that I think I'm sensitive to your issue. It's a real one. I recognize the difficulty. If you desire to be Catholic, I would just press through with RCA, find some place, and just bite the bullet and go through. But then don't necessarily limit yourself to your geographic parish in terms of thinking about your friendship or your social network.
Yeah.
In this day and age, honestly, there are probably a lot of social media contacts in the Catholic world in San Bernardino, ways of getting involved. I know in little old Birmingham, and we're not nearly as technologically advanced as you California people, we've got some of that going on here. There are networks of people in Theology on Tap and other groups that get together and they communicate through social media means. And, there's some pretty decent friend groups, and they sort of float around between parishes and meet places that aren't parish based as well. So stick with it. Acknowledge your difficulty. And ultimately, if you become Catholic, you might say, well, look, there is a dearth of programming at my parish, for people my age. Maybe the Lord is calling you to start programming for people in their mid-30s who need outreach and friendship groups. Maybe that's what you'll bring.
Could be. Robert, thank you so much for your call. Do appreciate that. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Looks like 3 lines open at the moment. 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Travis listening in Yakima, Washington on Sacred Heart Radio. Hello, Travis. What's on your mind today?
Hi. I guess you'd say I'm a Protestant Christian. I was raised in pretty conservative, Baptistic, Bible-believing churches. In fact, right now I'm a Presbyterian minister, but I'm considering Catholicism. And one of my hang-ups that I have is I haven't been able to get a clear answer on the issue of salvation and the relationship between works and faith, if works are meritorious, or if salvation according to the Catholic Church is a gift of grace. And that's kind of been a hang-up for me for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
I'm wondering if
I
can get an answer on that issue.
I can absolutely talk to you about that. So this is the issue that made me Catholic. Because like you, I was raised Presbyterian, and I believed that justification by faith alone, salvation is a pure work of grace, nothing that the human person can contribute at all, monergism all the way, predestination, the whole 9 yards. That was the article on which the church stands or falls. That's the way I understood it growing up Presbyterian. And, I ate Luther with spoons. I mean, he was just the bomb. And so I went to seminary and grad school to really deepen my appreciation of that core Protestant doctrine. And in my studies, one of the first things that struck me was, if this is the doctrine on which the church stands or falls, and the Reformation is a recovery of pristine Christianity, the Christianity of Scripture in the first 4 centuries, then I ought to find that doctrine, Luther's peculiar understanding of salvation, I ought to find that represented someplace in Christian antiquity, someplace in the world. Somebody else will have recognized this aspect of the Bible. And, of course, reviewing the history, I was exposed to a rude awakening, namely that no one before Luther in all of history had ever conceived of salvation the way Luther conceived of it. And that's not my own personal opinion. That's the consensus of the scholarship. And I would point you to somebody like Alistair McGrath's 2-volume History of the Doctrine of Justification, Justitia Dei, where McGrath, who is himself an evangelical Protestant, concludes that Luther's peculiar theology of salvation was, and I quote, a complete theological novum, an utter innovation, a novelty, a new thing that had never before been seen in history. So that was a problem. And it was also a problem from my understanding of the Bible, because if the Bible is perspicuous, as Protestants teach, if it's intrinsically intelligible, it makes sense, and you can understand its core message, then you would think that somebody reading the Bible someplace else before the 15th century would have seen this. And yet everywhere I looked in Christian antiquity, whether they were Latins or Greeks or Syriacs or Coptics or Eritrean or you name it, right, nobody came to this conclusion. So that was kind of disturbing. So then I thought, well, maybe I need to plow into the writings of Paul himself a little bit more intensely, and I don't want to read anything Catholic because I'm trying to stay away from those evil Catholics. So let me just read Protestant scholarship. So I plowed into modern Pauline studies, particularly on this issue of works of the law. And the situation got worse because I found out that most of the modern interpreters of Paul, unless they're just absolute dyed-in-the-wool, denominationalists, but the scholarly consensus was that Luther had gotten Paul wrong, right? And so ultimately I had to confront the question, well, if nobody in antiquity read Paul like Luther, and if modern scholarship doesn't read Paul like Luther, well, why did Luther go wrong, and what is Paul actually talking about? So now let me kind of give you not only my view, but also sort of the consensus view. All right, so if you look at Jesus, it's pretty evident that Jesus has a clear doctrine of merit. He doesn't use the word merit, but meritorious just means something that deserves recompense. That's what merit means, right? Jesus clearly has a doctrine of recompense, of reward for moral behavior. It's woven through everything he says, and particularly the Sermon on the Mount. He says, if you pray in secret, if you give alms in secret, if you fast in secret, your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. Here are some penitential behaviors that merit reward, or they can expect recompense, right? And when Jesus turns to the question of the last judgment, and he says, I'm going to sit up here and judge the nations, and left and right, goats and sheep. What's the criterion? Did you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty, etc.? If you did these things, come on in. If you didn't do these things, off you go. And many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, Lord. And I'll say, away from me, I never knew you. So Christ's own criteria are profoundly ethical. When he considers the nature of somebody who is a participant in God's kingdom, you get the Beatitudes. Again, it's entirely around the inner disposition of charity and humility and self-giving and hungering for righteousness. It's a disposition to do good rather than some mere faith that's imputed as righteousness. So that's Jesus' teaching, and it's pretty hard to ignore that, all right? So hard, in fact, that Protestant interpreters for years have tried to relativize the teaching of Jesus in their understanding of salvation. Luther, as you know, did this by inventing the hermeneutic of law and gospel and imagined that every command, threat, or promise in the Bible was somehow relegated to secondary status, right, to sort of frighten us and scare us into belief in the gospel. But the real thing was the gospel that he thought was clearest in St. Paul. So what is Paul talking about? Well, there are really only two books of the New Testament that clearly go into a theology of justification and works of the law, and those are Romans and Galatians. And Paul himself tells us the context for these remarks. In broad strokes, it is the question of the inclusion of Gentiles into the covenant people of God. That's what prompts these reflections. What do you do with Gentiles who become participants in the project called Israel? Do you impose the Mosaic law on them? And Paul's argument in both of these books is that merely handing people a piece of legislation, even something as sublime as the Mosaic law, will not in fact make them righteous. On the contrary, it will often provoke them to sin. That's his argument in Romans 7, right? If I just walk up to you and go, do this, you typically your response is try and make me, right? I mean, it has the opposite effect. Mere exhortation will not, in fact, effect righteousness. What is required is a new creation, right? That you must be changed in your interior life. That's why he can say in Romans 2:13, it's not hearing the law, it's rather obeying the law by which you will be declared righteous, Romans 2:13. So how do you do that? How do you effect the interior transformation that will bring about that obedience to the law? Now, take note, in verses 25 to 29 of chapter 2, the book of Romans, Paul says, it's not the one who is circumcised in the flesh by the hands of men. It's the one who is circumcised in the heart. Now, of course, he's quoting Ezekiel 36, who's circumcised in the heart. Such a one fulfills the dikaimatetunamu in Greek, the righteous requirements of the law. He doesn't say ergon namu, the works of the law. He says the righteous requirements of the law, those things that make the law to be righteous, right? The love of God and neighbor. And he uses the same word again in Romans 8 when he talks about the work of the Spirit in the heart. The one who receives the gift of the Spirit has fully met the righteous requirements of the law. Why? Because love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control flow from within them and come with an obligation, a mandate to cooperate, to walk with the Spirit. If you don't do that, Paul says, you're toast, right? So through faith and the sacraments, we die with Christ in baptism, we're raised again with him to new life. The love of God is shed into our hearts, poured into our hearts. That's Romans 5:5, right? Such that we fulfill God's righteous requirements, right? Not because of the circumcision of the flesh done by the hands of men, not because we've avoided certain foods, not because we followed the other regulations of the Mosaic Code, but because we have that inner disposition that Christ demands in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. That is the gift of the Spirit in our lives, right? That's why Gentiles don't have to follow the Mosaic Code, because the dikaimatetunamu, the righteous requirements of that law, are fully met in Gentiles in virtue of the fact that they've believed in Christ and they've received the gift of the Holy Spirit. I mean, that's the testimony that Peter gives when he's at Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, and they say, do we make these Gentile fellows circumcise themselves? And Peter says, they've got the Spirit. You saw it. You see what happened. So don't put on them a burden that our ancestors were not able to bear. But you Gentiles, you better toe the line and walk the walk, or you're out. That's why 2 Peter 2 says, if you go back to fornication and adultery, it's better that you never have entered the way of righteousness. So there's no conflict between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of the apostles. It's one perfectly coherent gospel, and we don't have to rely on these artificial means like, Luther's false hermeneutic.
Yeah. Travis, we hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for your call. And in a moment, we're going to take a break here. We'll be talking with Mike in Waukegan, Illinois, also Jim in Texas, Debbie in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Gabrielle in Brooklyn. Lots of calls on a very busy Tuesday here on Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on EWTN. Do stay with us.
EWTN offers the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass live every day at 8 a.m. Eastern. To be sure you don't miss out, we can send a link to your email inbox every day. Visit EWTN.com and click on subscribe.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
The Oklahoma State Legislature and Governor deserve the applause and gratitude of an entire nation. Governor Kevin Stitt signed 9 pro-life bills into law. Some of them include protections for women from dangerous chemical abortion drugs, a heartbeat bill, and the return of Oklahoma's law prohibiting abortion should Roe v. Wade be overturned. Abortionists must now be board certified in obstetrics and gynecology, and abortion is officially labeled as, quote, unprofessional conduct. In addition, it's now illegal to traffic in the aborted body parts of unborn babies for research. Imagine the number of lives that'll be saved from the brutal act of abortion and parents spared from the emotional horrors afterward. We thank God for these elected officials who protect all their citizens, born and unborn.
Like us on Facebook at Life Issues and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
Smart speakers help with a lot these days. Did you know you can use your smart speaker to hear the top stories of the day from a Catholic perspective? If you have an Alexa, just say, Alexa, open Catholic News.
Welcome back to the latest news from Catholic News Agency.
For more information on how to get the latest Catholic news on your smart speaker or wherever you get your podcasts, go to CatholicNewsAgency.com/smart speakers.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett, the host of Catholic Answers Live. Father Hugh Barber and Tim Staples, 2 hours of open forum. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number, we have one line open right now at 833-288-EWTN. Yours to snag at 833-288-3986. All right, let's go to Debbie. Debbie is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hey, Debbie, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you for taking my call, and I have a question. I heard Dr. Anders say that Jesus didn't have to die to save us. Did I hear that wrong, or?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So I was repeating the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a doctor of the church, and in fact the common doctor of the church, whose opinions are regarded as safe for Catholics to hold on almost any topic. And when Thomas asks the question, it's a hypothetical question, was it necessary in the sense that God could not have saved us in some other way? Was it metaphysically necessary, somehow intrinsic to the nature of reality, such that human beings could not be saved absent the death of Christ? St. Thomas's answer to that question is no, because nothing outside of God can compel God, right? There's no metaphysical necessity in the world such that God has to do things one way, right? God is the one that imposes the necessity, not us. And God could have, if he chose to, could have redeemed us in some other way. But he did not redeem us in some other way. This is the way he redeems us. He chose to redeem us through the death of his Son. And like many issues in theology, many things in divine revelation, if we try to discern, what is the reason that God did it this way instead of some other way, we can never answer that question with satisfaction because we don't know the mind of God, right? Not directly. So what St. Thomas does instead is say, well, rather than try to discern the absolute necessity of Christ's death, I will instead reflect on its fittingness, why it's reasonable that God chose to redeem the world through Christ. And that's the way he argues. And so God does in fact redeem the world through the death of Christ. The death of Christ is presented to us as the unique means whereby anyone who is saved will necessarily be saved through the death of Christ. So it's necessary for us. We're compelled, right, by the necessity of Christ's death. But it's not necessary that God do it this way. God could have done it some other way, but this is the way God chose to do it. So we're all on board because this is what God has revealed.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. Hey, Debbie, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Mike in Waukegan, Illinois, listening on the great WSFI. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi. How are you doing today?
Very well. What's your question?
Yeah. My question is, I guess, it was about, is it okay for a Catholic to smoke pot or not? I guess and work from that point on.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I will speak to you from my own personal opinion, and, informed by Catholic moral theology and a little bit of knowledge about, American culture and medicine and things of that sort. Now,
I should point out that our phone screener, Matt, put down regarding this is medical marijuana.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay.
So that's what I'm actually responding to.
Okay, very good.
I'm going to give you my personal opinion, all right? So, first of all, we have a moral duty to live a virtuous life. And that's premise number one, right? And virtue, according to the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, is nothing other than the life in accord with right reason. That's what virtue means. It means we choose the reasonable good, and we develop the habits of virtue that facilitate our life in accord with the reasonable good, okay? To do that, to live a virtuous life, I need to be reasonable, and I need my faculties about me, right? And so if I choose to deliberately impede my faculty of reason and choice and deliberation, then it's gonna get in the way of the life of virtue. And so that's why St. Paul doesn't talk about marijuana, but he does talk about alcohol, and says that you ought not to become intoxicated on wine. And presumably he didn't have a lot of other options for intoxication, but it's not that there's something intrinsically evil about grapes. It's the intoxication part that was the issue, right?
Okay.
Don't impede yourself in that way.
Okay.
And so I think that we can say generally that it's a bad idea to become intoxicated, right? Now, obviously there are some situations, like if I'm going to go into surgery, and they're going to cut open my intestines, you want to knock me out? Go ahead. My goal here is to be able to survive the surgery without, having total trauma, right? I'm not aiming for the state of intoxication. All right. So that's my first premise. Now, I recognize that, there are many people, it's very popular culturally right now to propose marijuana as a solution to a lot of medical issues. Now, on that, I would point your attention to the National Academy of Sciences has recently put out, I think, about a nearly 500-page study on the purported benefits of medical cannabis. And you can look at it yourself, but the long and the short of it is they're not nearly as beneficial as people would like you to think. And there are maybe a few issues where, yes, this has some therapeutic value, but there are many fewer, and the effects are much more muted, and particularly when you compare them to alternate treatments, than many of the proponents, I think, would advocate for. Now, I don't live in a state that has legal marijuana for medical purposes, but I have driven through and visited such states. And it seems to me, and this is just my own personal opinion based on, the billboards, that the medical marijuana thing is a Trojan horse a lot of times for potheads. for people who, I need a prescription so I can go get my marijuana, and the way the stuff is marketed, at least to me, seems to speak to that, sort of 60s hippie vibe rather than, this is a real genuine treatment for your medical problems. This is really an excuse to facilitate your otherwise marijuana habit. Now, I'm sure that doesn't characterize everybody, but that's clearly the way the marketing looks, at least in some of the states I've traveled through that are promoting this. And so, if somebody tells me, my doctor says that such and such a drug is the only treatment for my medical condition, and there's no other way I can get to that end, and it's absolutely necessary for me to live a healthy life, I can't argue with the medical professionals. I'm not a doctor. I'm not qualified to speak on that issue. But for me, right, because I value my clarity of thought and the pursuit of virtue and my clarity of mind, and I want to avoid living a life habituated to drugs, especially if there's a temptation there to deal with my own psychological trauma that way, and kind of, shut down my critical faculties. I'm probably, myself, I'm going to look for another medical treatment, right? I'm going to avoid this because I think it comes with a lot of dangers, and I think for a lot of people, it's a convenient justification for a habit that may have other motives. Now, that may not be you, and I'm not trying to criticize you at all, right? I don't think it's safe morally for an individual for those reasons, right? I don't think it's necessarily in accord with the life of virtue. But again, I'm not an expert on the science, and I'm not trying to prescribe medical treatments for people. Just talking about the way I see the data, the way I see Catholic moral thinking.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Jim now in Texas, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, Jim. What's on your mind today?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your program. I don't get to listen a whole lot because of work, but when I do listen, I always learn a lot about the Catholic faith and appreciate y'all's service. My question really relates more to, an young adult child who, unfortunately, like so many across our country, has left the faith. She was a good person, was raised Catholic, confirmed, and then somewhere shortly after confirmation, early years of college, she just kind of seemed to drift away. Still will, go to Mass with us a couple of times a year when we see her, but I'm just struggling, pray for her every night. Overall, she's a good person, but just looking for a little guidance on how to ignite that conversation with her. So I appreciate any feedback or suggestions
thank you. I appreciate the question. So the number one reason that people give for walking away from the church when you survey them is that they claim that the church is not meeting their spiritual needs. And I take that complaint seriously. I think if somebody tells me that, it means that somehow or another the church in its ministries has not spoken in a way, has not reached out to that person in a way that they find relevant, that they find intelligible. And so, somebody early in the show asked me, Anders, why do you read all these books and drop all these book references? Well, because that's relevant to me. That's my mode of engagement. Mm-hmm. That's not everybody's mode of engagement, and I'm perfectly well aware of that, right? And, some of my own kids are not energized by the kinds of questions that energize me. My own wife, if I want to put her to sleep, all I have to do is say, hey, can I tell you about a book I read? And it's immediately, out she goes, know? And so, some of this is really going to be very subjective to the person, what's relevant in that individual's life, and how are they failing to find those existential spiritual needs met by the ministry of the church as it's presented to them. And there's no better way into that conversation than genuine, engaged, loving presence. And so I think less important than having a toolbox of apologetical questions is a deep personal relationship and presence to the individual, so that they feel comfortable sharing their spiritual and psychological and social and existential needs in an unthreatening way, and not feel like, they don't want to open up because, well, they just know what Dad's going to say, or they know what Mom's going to say, so why even bother? Trying to cultivate that trust. Your own vulnerability, I think, is a great opening, as you can talk about struggles and difficulties in your life, not with an agenda to, how can I turn this conversation into proselytism, but because you're seeking intimacy, you're seeking trust, you're seeking loving relationship. And so you don't have to be on the defensive to always defend your faith or defend the church, but to be able to talk openly about the highs and lows, the blessings, the benefits, the costs, the dangers, the troubles that you've had in relationships with or without the church. Just build that trust and intimacy, because you're Catholic, right? And you're a faithful Catholic, and you're a knowledgeable Catholic. So your Catholicism will bleed through at every moment as you express yourself in the world as a Catholic, right? And so that's your witness. Your witness is being a virtuous, loving, kind Catholic presence in this person's life. And I would say, get on God's timeline and not yours.
Yeah.
And we want to solve problems. That's natural, right?
Especially men.
Yeah.
Especially men.
Sure. But this might be, this might be a 10-year project. This might be a 20-year project.
Mm-hmm.
This might be a project that comes to completion at your funeral. The witness of your entire life might be the hinge question. Like, put the onus on God and don't bear that burden all by yourself.
Great advice. Well, we thank you so much for your call, Jim. It is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Want to remind you to be sure to join us for EWTN News Nightly, and that'll be tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and television. Tonight, Tracy Sable discusses President Biden's remarks at the UN's General Assembly earlier today, and why pro-lifers should be concerned about the infrastructure plan now being discussed in Congress. Check it out tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and television, EWTN News Nightly. All right, back to the phones here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Here is Gabrielle in Brooklyn listening on her Alexa device. Hey there, Gabrielle. What's on your mind today?
I have a friend, a Protestant friend. I'm sharing my faith with him. And he's very receptive. The thing is, I understand that Protestants don't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And in order for me to explain where I'm coming from, I kind of need to know where he's coming from. I don't think he really understands why he doesn't believe in these things. He just said, well, my pastor said, the Bible said, or whatever. So what I would like to know is, what is the origin of the disbelief?
Yes.
Like, who decided that these things are not true?
Yes. So, of course, the father of the Protestant Reformation was Martin Luther. Luther believed both in the real presence and the perpetual virginity of Mary. John Calvin, who was another very important early Protestant theologian, also believed in the real presence, but with a twist. I won't go into the twist, but it's a little bit more muted in Calvin. It's there, but it's a bit more muted. There's another early Protestant theologian, also from Switzerland. Calvin was in Switzerland, from Zurich, named Ulrich Zwingli. And Zwingli denied the doctrine of the real presence very, very early in the 1520s. And in fact, the Protestant movement split over this question. So Zwingli and his followers denied the real presence. Luther and his followers affirmed the real presence. Calvin was trying to be a mediating figure between those two camps, right? And Luther actually had a meeting with Zwingli, right, called the Marburg Colloquy, where they tried to agree on the principles of the Reformation. and they got down to the business of the real presence, and they couldn't agree on the real presence, and each was convinced that the other was the devil. Like, this was a make-or-break issue for them. And so Protestantism split. So there have been those two camps all along. And there are still Protestants today who believe in the real presence. Of course, all Lutherans are committed confessionally. Their own doctrinal statements teach the doctrine of the real presence. Zwinglians, to this day, are committed against it. Now, in the United States and in England, in the English-speaking Protestant world, the Zwinglian and the Calvinist views predominated. Now, there are a lot of Lutherans in the United States, especially up in the Midwest, but most of the country and in New England, and the guys that wrote the history books and so forth, and most of your TV preacher types, the kind of big brand name Protestant media figures, come more from the Calvinist and the Zwinglian vein, and so they're much cooler towards the doctrine of the real presence. Now, when it comes to the perpetual virginity of Mary, that's something that many Protestants continued to believe into the 17th century. And it eventually faded away, and you'll find some that would still affirm it, but by and large they don't. Now, I can't give you an exact date or a figure when that doctrine faded out, but I do think that as Protestants themselves had a very strong antipathy, a dislike for Marian devotion. They didn't like Catholic devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. There was a tendency to devalue any Marian doctrine that would elevate her in any way, because that would seem to encourage the Catholic devotion to Mary. And so eventually, they just turned on it and began to outright deny the perpetual virginity. But the early Protestants and into the 17th century, even the Calvinists, continued to affirm that doctrine.
Okay. Gabrielle, hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Dave is in Cincinnati listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey, guys. Congratulations on your ministry, and it brought me back after over 30 years of being my own pope.
Wow. Thank you.
And it's sad that people would not honor and venerate the earthly mother of our Lord and Savior. It's mind-boggling, really. But my question is about Mary, sort of, kind of, in a way. A question that keeps going through my mind is, why did Jesus come when he did? And one of the answers I came up with was, maybe he was waiting for someone holy enough. And I'm just wondering, in theological circles, what's the, what do you guys come up with on that?
Absolutely. I can speak to that. Thank you. So it's a good question. He wasn't waiting for someone holy enough. That's not why he delayed his coming. Because, of course, Blessed Virgin Mary was chosen and predestined to be the Mother of God, and she was holy in virtue of this purely unmerited gift of the Immaculate Conception. So had God wanted a pure vessel for the Son of God to become incarnate, of course, he could have created one at any time in history, and that's the way he did the Blessed Virgin Mary. Predestined her for that role, graced her with the dignity of the Immaculate Conception, and so this pure vessel was made ready to receive the incarnation of the Son of God. So that's not why he delayed. There is a reason why Christ delayed, and St. Paul tells us that Christ only came in the fullness of time. So there was a historical development that had to happen in the history of salvation to prepare the world for the coming of Christ. And there are a couple elements that had to occur before Christ came. So some that were internal to the people of Israel, and some that were common to the human race. Let me speak to the last one first. St. Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century doctor of the Church, Catholic theologian, very important figure, said that the Lord wanted to habituate men, and he means people, habituate the human race to the divine Logos before the incarnation of the Logos. Of course, St. John says, in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word there is Logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, but he became incarnate, took on flesh, and dwelt among us, right? That's Jesus Christ. This Logos, this divine Word that became incarnate, St. John tells us, was the true light that gives light to every man. the true light that gives light to every man, right? And Catholic theology has held for 2,000 years that illumination of the divine Logos in the souls of men is our rational knowledge of the natural law, our ability to discern the principles of morality written into our own hearts. And you see this development in the history of culture as you read ancient history, in the growing awareness of peoples that the path to the divine is not simply through bloody animal sacrifice, but it's through the ethical life, which is something other than mere ritual cultic observance. It actually has to do with things like justice and fairness and kindness and charity and temperance. And so you see these realizations not just in sacred scripture, but you see them in, say, the writings of Plato and the Stoics and Aristotle and pre-Christian thinkers who really created the intellectual context in which the gospel would come to be articulated in the Roman and the Hellenistic world. So there's that development outside the people of Israel. But there's also a development within the history of the people of God that in some extent tracks the same sort of idea. So you have a sort of cultic ritual religion that God gives to the Israelites, but at the same time, he criticizes it, and especially in the prophets, like Prophet Isaiah. He'll say, well, I'm not really all into animal sacrifice. That's what God will say. What I'm really into is justice. And it's not this circumcision in the flesh that's really all that important. It's the circumcision in the heart. We find that in Ezekiel chapter 36. And, the Israelites, early in their history, they were not monotheists. They were polytheists and were very superstitious. And they still had idols, and they sacrificed to them. And it kind of took a long time to beat that out of their system. Mm. And God talks about that in the book of Deuteronomy. He says, I'm going to give you this great law. It's good stuff. It's going to show the nations what a righteous God I am, but you're not going to keep it. I know you're not going to keep it.
Wow.
And so God actually predicts an historical development of the people of God all the way to the exile and return as a necessary concomitant to this interior innovation by grace that will be the mission of the Messiah and ultimately open up faith in the God of Abraham to the whole world. So you had to have an internal development within the people of God, mm-hmm. and then in the teaching of St. Irenaeus, this development of human culture to be habituated to the divine Logos so that the coming of Christ would come, as he puts it, in the fullness of time.
All right. Dave, thanks so much for your call. Mike is a first-time caller in Plymouth, Michigan. Mike, we've got about 30 seconds. What's on your mind today?
Okay, I'll make it quick. Gentlemen, I love the show. I got a question for the good doctor. When Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that I am, at least some of them responded with John the Baptist. Now, Jesus and John were contemporaries, relatives, in fact, the same age. Why would people have confused them with each other? Did they believe in reincarnation, perhaps?
That's a great question. I'm shooting from the hip here, okay? This is my best guess. Jesus and John participated in the same religious movement. Jesus was actually part of John's movement. This was an age before Twitter. This was an age before Facebook.
Yeah.
And so people had heard of the John the Baptist Messianic movement, this baptizer guy who was calling for the coming kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. And here comes, somebody else preaching the same message who's drawing a big crowd. It seems reasonable to me that those that, they didn't have his picture up on their wall or on their Facebook page would go, oh, he's one of those guys. He's that John the Baptist guy? That makes sense to me.
Okay. Thanks so much for your call, Mike. Couldn't get to Marie in Toms River, New Jersey, or Lenore in New York. Please call us back tomorrow. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we're here tomorrow, Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm Tom Price. God bless.
Left behind. Lawmakers share the stories of Americans abandoned in Afghanistan. And coronavirus crisis. Workers over